So my take on all this is really the product of 20, 25 years studying wage stagnation and wage inequality, and debates over that time about whether technological change was responsible for wage inequality or wage stagnation. And my conclusion over that time period, which I think has been gathering, I don't know about the consensus yet, but I think it's been gaining ground, is that no, technological change has had very little to do with wage stagnation or inequality, especially in the 2000s. So when I then come across people invoking, we got to fear the robots, and they're basically coming up with two types of problems. One of which is the robots are going to take all our jobs, we won't have enough jobs. Therefore, we need universal basic incomes or something like that. You can believe that or not. So that one problem could be not enough jobs. Another problem could be that automation, robots, is going to lead to inequality. I think Richard and I are pretty much in agreement that the number of jobs is not so much the issue. I'm going to go over why I think that. He didn't really make the case for that, and then I'll say why I think the wage inequality is not the issue. And for me, the whole point is the following. As someone involved in a policy think tank in Washington, I wrestle with what I consider are the major crises that we've already had for 30 years of wage stagnation, broad-based wage stagnation. So my question is, why are we going to get worried about what someone says is going to happen 10, 20 years from now because of technological change? And I hate to say, you know, Frank says, let's not miss the boat this time. I'll just say to you, Frank, I didn't miss the boat on trade. The economists basically did two things. You could either, if you're nice, you think that they just failed to tell the people what they knew. If you're not nice, you would say that they lied. Because straight up trade theory says that when you increase trade, you're going to get inequality. And basically people like me that said you would get inequality were accused of being economic ignoramuses for 20 years, okay? So I'm not missing any, I didn't miss any boats in the last 20 years, and I think what I'm about to say, you'll see I'm not missing any in the future. So one of the problems with dealing with this, the claims about technology, is that sometimes people say it's just in the future, and sometimes they say it's already here. So I'm not sure. You know, Richard was saying more the future. If you read The Second Machine Age from the MIT guys, they say it's both here and it's going to accelerate. And when you look in the future, it's mostly what I call oh wow stories. You know, like look what a robot can do, without very much conjecture about what's the scale of automation, how quickly, and who will be affected, so that you can actually look and see what they think is going to happen and compare it to what's happened in the past. Because we've had automation for 150 years, right? So it's hard to critique something that is so fluffy. So one question that a very conventional economist would ask is if we're going to have no jobs in the future, how come over the last 150 years we haven't seen an ever-increasing technological unemployment? Something that the Second Machine Age guys don't even bother to consider and answer. So I'll tell you the straight-up conventional economic story that I think has some merit, and it's the following. We're talking about when employers are going to automate because robots become cheaper or they're more substitutable, all those different kinds of things. So they're only going to do it if they can produce things more cheaply, right? That's the whole reason you would automate. Okay, if you can produce things more cheaply, so that's where most of the analysis stops. Oh, look, there's lots of robots that are going to replace lots of people. And I, for instance, have no doubt that there's going to continue to be lots of occupations and industries where there's going to be displacement, okay? But the question is, why stop there in your analysis? Because every place where there's displacement, costs are going to go down. If costs are going to go down, then what the employers are going to charge for the goods or services is likely to have a lower rate of inflation or actual price drops. If you have a price drop or slower inflation, then let's say it makes refrigerators cheaper, okay? Then more people can buy refrigerators. Or if you buy the same number of refrigerators, you have more money left over, right? Instead of buying a refrigerator for $1,000, you buy it for $900. If you saved $100, it doesn't disappear unless people's demand, you know, their needs have disappeared or they fail to grow. It's something we haven't really observed, okay? So if they have another $100, they're going to spend it on something. That something will require people to make it. Now, so that means we have a process that's going on for many years where you can have technological change and we don't lose the number of jobs. It doesn't tell you what jobs, and it doesn't tell you whether they're good jobs or not. But the idea that we're not going to have enough jobs, I think requires an argument about why technological change in the future is so different. And I have never seen an argument made about why this process won't work. Okay? So let me just deal with, is there a reason to think that this is already upon us? So I looked at the productivity data from the San Francisco Federal Reserve Board, and each of the bars is a period of time, the one to the right, the most recent. So the first thing to note is that labor productivity certainly hasn't accelerated. That's well known, or should be well known. If there's some acceleration of technological change and automation, it's not reflected in our becoming more productive. It's also not reflected in a greater rate of capital investment, nor a greater rate of information equipment investment, which has actually substantially declined, or a rate of investment in software. So if the robots are increasingly here, they're done without capital and without software. I don't know, you know, it gives you a little bit of doubt whether we're being overwhelmed by robots or not. Okay, I'm going to skip the part where I tear apart this graph. You can ask in questions. This is where the second machine age guys say we're getting all this productivity, but there's no growth in hours. The missing piece there is that they fail to consider that we have slower growth. we have much slower growth, and they know that. And they don't bother to talk about that. So I'm going to talk about wage inequality. There's basically two stories about wage inequality. And say, you know, Frank is one, and Richard are both experts in this literature. And I've learned a lot from both of them. There's a more traditional story, which is that technological change has led us to need more college graduates. We hire more college graduates, their wages go up, the wages of people without a college degree go down, poof, inequality. The other, more recent, is that technological change shapes which occupations are expanding. There's been a story about occupations expanding at the top and at the bottom and not at the middle, which creates a hardship on the middle. Both stories don't have much merit, especially in the 2000s, and we can debate about whether they have any merit for the 80s and 90s some other time. But on education, here I'm comparing, it's not up to date, I'm sorry, but it would still be true. So I'm comparing the actual growth of the wage gap between the 95th percentile and the 50th percentile, and I'm comparing it to the growth of the wage gap between people with a college education or more against people who don't have a college degree. And you see in the earlier period, education wage gaps grew a lot, and so did wage inequality. In the second period, wage inequality didn't grow as much, but there's hardly any growth in the education wage gap. It's hard to believe that education wage gaps in recent periods have been pushing overall wage inequality. In fact, I can explain that education wage gaps solely on the basis of trade. So it's hard to believe that education wage gaps are really responsible. Here's another illustration. The college wage premium, that's how much does a college graduate, a BA only, make relative to a high school grad. And you can see that that grew a lot in the 80s and early 90s. It's flattened out over the last 15 years. If you believe, as I do, that the supply of college graduates has been steadily increasing, if this premium has flattened out, it implies that the relative demand for college graduates has slowed remarkably. So rather than it growing faster than ever, it's actually growing slower than ever. And here's something to show wage trends among college graduates just since 2000. And you can see that even the 90th percentile college grad didn't have wages much different than 2001 or 2. The 70th percentile college grad actually lost ground by 2011. By now, they're probably up a bit. But I'm just saying this is broad across college grads. Then I have my Marxist explanation. Can I say that in Texas? This is Groucho Marx. It's are you going to believe me or your lying eyes? You know, his wife comes into the bedroom, finds him with another woman, and he says that. Are you going to believe me or your lying eyes? Okay, so what do your lying eyes tell you about college graduates? They tell you that we have had a whole wave of college graduates out working as interns for free. My economics says that somebody working for free, there's no excess demand for that person. We also know that there's lower wages, less benefits for young college grads, and more underemployment in terms of college grads working in jobs that don't require a college degree. Those are things that people know and see around them, and it wars against the thinking that the demand for education is exploding, creating wage inequality. Okay, what about the occupations? Here's the explanation, which I'm going to show you is wrong in every which way. First, if you believe that technological change makes it that there's a change in which occupations are expanding. So technological change drives occupation employment shares. Let's say employment for high-wage occupations grows more than those for middle and low. It means that employers are bidding up the wages of people at the higher occupations. Okay? When the employment shares change, it also changes how much each occupation makes relative to each other, and that changes overall wage distribution. So here's a famous graph, a little bit hard to explain, but I'm going to, it's not hard to explain. I take that back. So let's say we take all occupations and we boil them down into 100 of them, and we rank them by wage. So there's low wage to high wage, and there's 100 occupations. And anywhere on the line for a particular period, each line is a decade or a period, you can see whether those occupations expanded, which means they're above zero, or they fell, which means they're below zero. Okay? So if you look at the blue, this is the 80s, you would see that there's a loss of occupations in the bottom 50%, and an increase of employment in the top 50%, and the more so at the very top. So that would mean that the people at the bottom are in less demand, people at the top in far more demand. What happened in the 2000s? Well, it's the yellow and the green lines. What you can see is that most of the employment creation was in the bottom 30% of occupations by wage level. And that very little in the yellow line, which is 99 to 2007, there was no expansion of jobs in the top 60%. And in the green line, which includes, in the recovery, there's some increase at the top. And I'll say that since 2012, I don't say anyone has graphed it, but I think there has been more growth of occupations at the top in the last few years. But for the most part, this does not support a story that technological change is leading to an expansion of demand for high wage occupations, therefore driving wage inequality. It's prima facie implausible, in fact. Here's Frank's work, where he looked at occupations. This goes through 2009, and looks at the occupations which are, the top two lines are working with new information, solving unstructured problems. Those are the occupations which we have the most, irregular cognitive skills. What do we call them? I mean, they're sort of the highest level skills. And you can see that in the 2000s, they didn't grow at all. They grew earlier. They didn't grow at all in the 2000s. Okay, so technological change by this is not expanding the occupations that require the wages. This is a graph which plots the change in the employment shares of an occupation against the relative wage changing. And this just shows that all the stuff about changing employment shares of occupations has almost nothing to do with wages. That most wage changes happen, what's happening within occupations, not across occupations. So all this fascination with occupations is misguided. So I'll just note, and we can go back to it, that there's nothing in the BLS projections that suggests that we're shifting to higher education jobs. Okay. Self-employment, for those who are, I'm doing well on time, okay. I come up across a lot of people who believe that the gig economy and freelancing is due to technological change and it's exploding. Nah. That's not happening. If you look at self-employment as a share of employment, and especially if you look at share itself, BLS actually measures self-employment. It includes people who actually hire other people. Okay? So the top line is all self-employed. The blue line is if there's self-employment, but you have no employees. And what this shows, looking at people's primary job, is that there has been no change in the share of employment that is self-employed in 20 years. So the gig economy is a subset of this. There's certainly no expansion. I will say that if you want to go into counts of anybody who does any freelancing, even a little bit of money, you can get a lot of people who do things. But then we're not into a discussion of the future of work. We're into the future of how do people get supplemental income, and we should be asking why are so many people trying to get supplemental income. Okay, let's look at gig jobs just for a little bit for your dining pleasure. So it's not, I asked Uber for data to get an update of this. They had said in 2015 that wages for the first 10 months were something like $3.5 billion. And so I extrapolated it very generously to say that they paid $4.7 billion in all of 2015. And that if you take out the expenses of the drivers, 20%, so they got $3.76 billion. Now that's a lot of money compared to in 2011, there was zero, okay? But if you look at it relative to the entire private sector wages, it's 0.06%, right? That's not even 0.1%. That's 0.06% of total wages paid to Uber drivers. And if Uber is 2/3 of the gig economy, as Alan Kruger says, then the gig economy is 0.1% of all wages. And, okay, we can come back to that. So what's the real problem? What do I think is the clear and present danger? It's that over the last 30 years, we've seen eroded pay and job quality for nearly all occupations. That wages have been stagnant, especially since 2002, nearly across the board. I would say that I think in periods of the last 2 years, real wages have grown, mostly because we've had very low inflation and a slight uptick in actual wage growth. But I think for the most part, we have an underlying economy of been stagnant wages. This is a chart showing how the growth of wages for different wage groups have fared since 1979. What that top line says is that annual wages for the top 1% grew 157%. Wages in that bottom line, the one that says 20.7, that's the bottom 90%. If the top 1% had not had its share of wages grow, we would have had double the growth in the bottom 90%. So one of the things that you have to, if technology is explaining things, someone has to tell me how did technology lift the incomes of the top 1%. I have emphasized for many years that we have growing productivity, but the wages and benefits of a typical worker have not grown correspondingly. In the earlier period before 1973, they grew together. Since 1973, productivity, that's the growth of the pie, grew by 73%. The hourly compensation of a typical worker, just 11%. So that represents pretty much stagnation. I think over 33 years or so, 32 years, and represents that we have a big problem. The BLS put out this graph recently, and it shows that the wage growth between 2007 and 14 was negative for the bottom 87% and negative for the bottom 80% in terms of wages and benefits. And so why? Rather than robots, what do I worry about? Well, first, for the most part, we have had excessive unemployment for 30, 40 years, sometimes at the hand of a Federal Reserve Board that was valuing keeping inflation low and making sure that when wages grew, to stamp it out as quickly as possible. We've had weakened labor standards. We have a minimum wage which is 25% below its value of 1968, even though productivity has more than doubled. We have salaried workers, which have 50 to 60% used to be eligible for overtime protections in the mid-1970s, and now less than 11%. President Obama's effort to, in fact, restore overtime protections to many salaried workers was overthrown by some judge in North Texas. We're not in North Texas, right? Globalization misspelled is a factor. Eroded institutions like collective bargaining are a factor. And the growth of the top 1% is part of it, because if you believe, like I do, that the top 1% incomes were driven by the wages in finance, the expansion of finance, and the pay to executives, which explains around 60% of the growth of the top 1%. And if you believe, as I do, that none of that reflects increased productivity, it means that what they took was wages and income not available to the rest of us. Thank you. So why don't we come up together, and we are longtime, listen, this is the greatest labor economist in the world. I say that often. We're longtime friends. He's been a mentor to me, and I did my dissertation based on data from one of his studies. I owe him forever, but I think this is a good chance to try to clarify where we agree and where we disagree.
Well, I thought this was a good chance for you to butter me up and then go, oof.
No. I'll get my chance. I'll get my chance.
Is this, I'm hooked up.
Okay.
Okay, so we're both hooked up. Yeah, I want to talk about some of the evidence that you did not deal with, or you dealt with summarily, because the number of occupations for which one reads serious stories that there are the technology changes occurring. And I didn't do the count of how many there were, but it is extraordinary. It went from the hamburger flippers to to the radiologists kind of people, anesthesiologists, and so on. And you can either regard that as, oh, it somehow doesn't show up in the aggregate BLS statistics, and therefore we should toss it out. Or you could maybe look at it and say, oh, that's a good sign of what's happening in the future. I think we should be looking to the future. And in the past, we've had these changes of inequality, and wherever somebody wants to put be it trade, be it technology, be it decline of unions, whatever it is, today we're standing there, and we've got to look toward the future. And I'd also just comment, in some of your graphs did show this inverse U at various times, and that is part of the polarization argument about that the middle is having the smallest gains, and the decline of the middle class is being driven by these factors. The increased employment in the jobs of the very low wage areas is very peculiar in the following sense, and it showed up in your graph of there was no connection between changes in shares. Well, that's a one-dimensional plot, and I kept thinking, who are the people in the lowest 10%? They're likely to be immigrants, and there's been a supply shift in that part of the economy that we would not have had, let's say, had it been that the only thing driving changes in supplies was the movement of more people into the universities. So I don't think it's sufficient to just show a plot of two things that began in 2007, and I've never.
I can show you each decade.
Yeah, but a plot that just shows that there are the points with no explanation. You haven't shown how much is due to the collective bargaining coverage. You haven't shown how much is due to the trade, and you have no terms in for the technology part. And it requires, I think, a lot more to make this case. And then you just have to say, I just don't care what all these stories, what all the work that people are doing in the whole machine area is. It's just irrelevant to the economy. When you see this McDonald's, which I just saw a few days ago in Phoenix, without any workers, you can't just say, oh, that's not important, because it hasn't yet shown up in the BLS statistics. And remember, our economics profession, to our shame, until the collapse of the banking system, never noticed there was anything wrong in the banking system. So we don't want to be in the position of saying, when something terrible happens, we've not been looking for what signals that something is going to be happening that we should worry about. You can attack me.
Okay. Yeah. So my view is that technological change is perhaps the single largest force shaping the labor market year in and year out. It has been and it will be. Okay. We lost secretaries in the 1990s. We lose other occupations in another period. There are periods of automation where the median wage grew a lot, and some where it didn't at all. I think, one has to make the argument as to what was different about the technological change, that it happened faster, or its qualitative character, its bias changed, and I don't think that there's, and I don't know about the future, but I can only say that I don't think the story of how technology is shaping occupational patterns in the last 20 years gives it much purchase on saying it's responsible for inequality. The one graph which shows that occupation employment patterns are uncorrelated with changes in relative wages by occupation. It was not meant to be dispositive on all of inequality. And I don't think I need to provide you with evidence of the role of the minimum wage or the role of unions in generating inequality or the role of globalization. Globalization is not everything, but it is something. I remember when you were attacked as a heretic for explaining 10% of wage inequality or 10 to 15% as globalization and immigration back in the early 90s by Jagdish Bhagwati. That you were an enemy of free trade was the first paragraph for just even considering that it could have something to do with inequality. But I think you raise a question. There are a lot of people here who are looking at technologies that they know, or driverless trucks, that they know can have substantial effects. How are we to regard that, right? What do we make of that? Is one of, one question is, I'm not sure, I doubt, I've not seen the argument why we should think that it would mean that we would have an overall job problem. I think we may agree on that. Okay. Then the question is, will it really batter particular segments of the workforce harder than others? And that is kind of unknowable at this point. But I think what you and I can agree on is that the policies we need to put in place to make sure that everybody benefits from the growth of technology are very similar to the policies we believe are needed now to deal with the clear and present danger of broad-based wage stagnation, including ownership issues, including strong labor standards and full employment, a strong safety net, strong EITC, whatever you want to call it. So, our policy recommendations will be very similar in either case, and it has to do with the fact that we need to make sure that whatever jobs are there pay decently.
Okay. Let me give because I think we also agree, and it should be, there's no single cause of our economic problems. And so when you do an analysis, if you say it's, as I did say, 10 or 15% was trade-related inequality, and 20% was due to the collapse of collective bargaining and other things, et cetera, et cetera. I hope in your world there's also a place for the technology, because it is not the single driving cause of everything, but it has a role to play in this, I think. And then on the policy agenda, the issue of the ownership is that the capital share has risen. And as your executives, and we both agree, because that's what the statistics show, that a lot of the executives' income is not, quote, normal labor income. It's also capital thing. So you need a policy.
Meaning stock options. They realize stock options.
That's right. But now it's more stock grants, because stock options were dangerous. After 2007, they couldn't cash in a lot of their options. So they've been shifting towards grants. And those clearly are things that one can deal with in a policy way. You can have a rule that would say, fine, you can use stock options whatever you want, but just like our retirement system and just like our medical insurance system, every worker has to be covered by the same incentive system, or et cetera, and that would cause a substantial change in the way people are being paid. Let me make one other comment, which is the one thing that neither of us discussed, which comes out in now a body of recent data, is that the difference in productivity of companies is incredibly going like this. So however much the top companies were more productive than the lower level companies, it's now pulling apart. It may be technology, no one knows what it is, and it pulls with it the workers. So I always think of, if I was a dot-com young person, and well, Facebook probably came after the dot-com, I don't know when exactly it was formed, but if I happened to join Facebook, I'm rich. If I happened to join, was it MySpace? MySpace, yeah. Well, I did do a calculation for the two companies. Wall Street valued them at about the same, maybe 10 years ago. And so you could have imagined I chose that company over the other. We have seen a part of the inequality that has really blossomed because, for reasons we don't know as yet, some companies are doing much better, and we do know that, they drag their workers along with that as part of profit sharing, as part of whatever things they do. And the underlying thing is that the companies are becoming incredibly different in their productivity. It's worth a hypothesis that some companies are jumping onto technology faster than others, but I say that's not been studied. The OECD had this report, if you saw, which took this fact and said, oh my God, it's true in every advanced country that there's increased inequality among companies. And then they just buried it in a report because they didn't know what to interpret it with. So there's another element in the story that we both did not cover. Everything is about individuals and the occupations. There's a company component that economists are just beginning to focus on, that maybe that's where we see more directly in the technology part. It's hard to imagine a company with incredibly increasing productivity not being a company that is adopting the most modern technological things, although, you know.
As I read the schedule, this is for you, I had a schedule for this. You guys are ready?
Can I make a 10-second comment, and then we'll have a Q&A?
10 seconds.
And that is my explanation of past wage inequality, and I agree that people haven't really figured out what the firm results really mean. But I think it's not a disparate group of factors. I think they have an underlying theme. And the underlying theme is very similar to what we've heard Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump say, that there's a system has been rigged. And that is, these are all changes that have been done on using the political power and policy-making authority of those with the most income, wealth, and power. That's why the minimum wage wasn't increased. That's why the labor laws haven't been reformed and unions have declined. That's what brought us the acceleration of globalization. That's what allowed the executives to do what they do and the financiers to do what they do. It's a unified theme, and I think we can agree on that. Whether or not there's some role for ongoing technological change, we can disagree on that. I think it's my grandma would call it bubkas.
Remember, James Madison said it in the Federalist Papers.
It's been going on a long time.
All right, so,
Yeah, well,
we get 2 mics to the back.
So we're going to take Q&A.
You got to walk to the back, I think.
okay. Question to the two gents, to the presenters. So assuming that there will be job destruction, there's a lot of talk about living minimum wage so that people can sit down at home, play video games, and not cause social unrest, or uniform distribution of means of production. Have you, gents, thought about perhaps more creative ways of sharing value based on contribution? So people, some ideas are being shared around, if you add art to an economic zone or social services, you'd get a share of the revenues paid by people or companies moving into this economic zone. What have you thought of so that people have a raison d'etre above and beyond just, not starving?
Well, I think people make their own decisions about what they can do leisure if they indeed have a higher income. I mean, this art can be, you can have a football stadium, you can have various things that'll make a local economy do better. You can have a lot of hospitals around here, a big biomedical thing, and I assume that does good for the Houston economy. It is true that companies nowadays locate increasingly near centers that are producing lots of papers and lots of patents. And we have a study, one of our postdoc student, actually, she is, found that where locations of plants no longer are near company headquarters, they're near universities and places of knowledge formation, which I haven't translated that into what it may mean for the employment or wages in the area. But it's clear we are in a knowledge economy, so if you consider art part of knowledge, good for that.
There is a debate. Some people are using the AI and all that to call for universal basic incomes, which means you get income not connected to your work. I'm not as big a fan of that. I really think that people want to work. We need to make work remunerative. It's going to need to be supplemented, especially at the bottom, with I would call work supports, help for childcare, healthcare, maybe pension. But I'll leave it to people to do their art, and I don't know. We should think about targeted programs to, listen, Franklin Roosevelt had the programs to provide work for theater and art. And I'm a believer that we will need to have targeted public service employment in areas of very high unemployment. That even when we have full employment, let's say we got down to 4%, there's going to be communities, rural as well as urban, that are going to have excessive unemployment. And I don't think we just go, we're done. So, maybe there's a role for art there.
Yeah. You shouldn't say 4%. Because
well, it could be lower than 4%.
Yeah, because it's the employment population rate that has not recovered from the recession. We have got the unemployment rate down, and focusing on the unemployment rate, I think, made a lot of people miss that we've lost 3% of the jobs and it has not recovered with this recovery. And so I would just, employment population rate up.
Friendly amendment approved.
I actually want to ask two questions, one of each speaker. So Larry, you first. I'm not totally sure what makes you dismiss the gig economy as quickly as you did. Certainly, as an explanation of what has happened to wage distribution in the past decade, it is still not large enough. But I think equating the gig economy with self-employment is dangerous because a lot of people working in the gig economy are not self-employed. Right. Most universities have a lot of people who work for them, but who are in the gig economy. They are sort of ad hoc, adjunct professors, people like that. And equating the gig economy with Uber strikes me as even more hazardous because certainly in the next 10 years, it seems very plausible that what technology is going to do is they're going to have Uberization of anything from babysitters to plumbers to movers to anything. And so the fact that the technology is causing a major shift, not only on who works in what occupation, but the nature of work, is something that you ought to embrace and not reject. Now, as far as Dick is concerned, there's something about you that strikes me as slightly self-contradictory, because you said on the one hand, it matters who owns the robots. That's what counts. But you also say the cost of robots is going to come down, and it's going to come down more and more as more robots are making robots. The cost of robots, most of it is fixed cost, right? The marginal cost of producing another robot once you have a prototype is going to be low. Right. And so in the limit, if the marginal cost of robots is going to be very low and the price is going to be low, the people who own the robots may own an asset that isn't worth very much because they are so cheap to reproduce if you can reproduce them under considered returns to scale. And so in fact, I'm losing less sleep over who owns the robots than you do, because I think in the end, they will become very cheap, as you yourself said.
Well, that's a question I'm doing what Larry does. Looking back at the huge rise of capital's share of income, and it isn't just the value of the robot, it's how many, or the machines. Robots is just a catchphrase. It's the machines And if it's either the price of the machines or the number or amount of machines, and the share of income is the multiple of the two divided by total. So I see nothing at present that would reduce capital's share of income except the Great Depression, which would clearly devastate profits in all major companies. And so I would just, my answer is I don't think it's self-contradictory. I've got the P and the Q, and if the Q is increasing while the P is going down, that still could mean more monies. And certainly some of the major tech companies, the prices of some of their goods goes down, and they sell massively more, and their profits goes up.
So on the gig economy, I guess this comes from going to a lot of conferences on the future of work, where there's so much fascination with Uber and so-called gig work. And my view is that the gig economy is worth a workshop, but not a plenary at any conference on the future of work. And so I looked into self-employment because the gig economy is a proper subset of that. Well, it's they're
employed people in the gig economy.
yeah, I understand.
Yes.
I've looked at people who have as their second job self-employment, and it's gone down. I've looked at the first job. I showed you the first job. It's the same as 20 years ago. In the second job, it's actually gone down. The reason why I looked directly at Uber is that there's research by Alan Kruger that says basically Uber is 2/3 of the gig economy. You can not believe that. You can believe that he's only looking at firms, at people who are selling directly to customers and not to people who sell to firms making things. So maybe it's double that size. If there's an equal amount of the gig economy of people selling to employers who are producing intermediate inputs, then they're 0.2% of all wages, okay? But the point is that my view of what we should be talking about with the future of work is how people make their living. And if there's a lot of people getting extra income based on doing a little bit of gig work on the side, which is what is true across the gig economy. There's research by Intuit. Uber itself says the majority of its workers work 10 to 12 hours a week. So, you know, that's why it's a workshop, not a plenary. It's not a path to which, you know, a large share of workers are going to earn their main income in the future. At least that's my belief.
Yeah, I disagree on one point. Maybe you'll give a good answer. Because there was the recent study by Larry Katz and Alan Kruger of alternative work arrangements, which shocked me. That study showed, I may get the year slightly wrong, so like, I don't know, in 2000 or something.
5 to 15.
It went to 5 to 15. That was that 10-point increase in the fraction of Americans who say they are under alternative work arrangements. And that did not include self-employed in the thing. That's what I think he means by the gig. Whatever, but I prefer the word alternative work arrangements.
So we're agreeing.
Yeah.
We call it contingent work, but that's not self-employment.
Right, I agree. It's not but that is an increase of insecure jobs for 10% more people, and that was post the recovery from the recession.
Right.
So this recession, not only is the employment population rate lower than it had been by 3 points, it also, part of the sort of recovery of jobs consisted of incredibly insecure jobs. And just a footnote, my daughter had one of these jobs as a college student in which she's, quote, she's not on call, but she's sort of on call by the retail store that hired her for the summer. And they tell her, yeah, oh no, we don't need you today, and we need you. She doesn't need the income in the sense that she's gonna, but if you're a person faced with that kind of insecurity, and that 10-point increase, I must say, it shocked me. I never thought that would occur.
So we have a heated agreement here, may I just say? Go on.
Two more
My question is addressed to both our speakers. With the proposed renegotiation of international trade deals that affect the United States, there is some concern amongst American business that this will adversely affect U.S. economic strength. So my question is, what opportunities do you see for global economic policy to drive capital accumulation? Thank you very much.
Capital what?
To drive what?
Capital what?
Capital accumulation?
Capital accumulation. You mean to make sure that multinational corporations do very well? Is that what you're saying?
Or to spread the wealth amongst their workers?
Yeah. So I had the distinct displeasure of heading a think tank that was cited by Donald Trump more than any other think tank. That's true. In his trade. My first response to any reporter who would call would be that no one wants to be associated with a bigot, so I'll say that here. And I don't think any discussion of the transition to a Trump world should occur without saying that we can't be having just a simple policy discussion when it seems like certain members of our community by religion, race, or country of origin are going to be demonized and perhaps hurt. So that being said, I don't think that renegotiating the trade deals, all of which I opposed, is either practical or going to get somewhere. And you will note that Trump has never said what in these trade agreements he would actually seek to change. It's because it's a scam. He says that, but then he moves to a policy agenda that's deregulation and cutting taxes for rich people and corporations. If you want to really do something on the international front, copying what our mutual friend Larry Summers says, why don't we have an international agreement to make sure that multinational corporations and rich people have to pay their full share of taxes? Because there's $1 trillion of taxes that are shifted each year from capital to labor. So let's deal with that. Let's not worry about opening up NAFTA. If we want to deal with trade, I think there's issues of currency manipulation, et cetera, that are far more consequential than anything that was actually in NAFTA. In fact, there wasn't a currency chapter in NAFTA.
Wonderful debate. I recall, Larry, you said something in the middle of your talk about how, and this is a trope I've heard before, that, well, we've had automation, we've had increased productivity in the past, it always works out fine. Nobody's shown me why it's any different now than it was in the past. And that's this elephant in the room. I'm constantly hearing that refrain. And yet, the talk right before your talks was about the cognitive computing economy, about the idea of machines creating knowledge, someday innovating, thinking, doing things that we consider fundamentally part of the creative process of humans. So it seems to me like everything's different from the past. And I'm very curious from both of you what you think of this, what I consider a sea change and what we mean by technology and innovation.
Well, Larry's asked me this question even last night. He says, so what's different? And I think what is different is the current generation of machines. It's the artificial intelligence, much more than the robotic movements or flying, which we saw kind of, they'll take a long time to catch up with us or with butterflies or the flying bees that we saw this morning. Given that, we do have this artificial intelligence that in specified spaces is able to take things that humans have thought as our forte and do better than us. It's in very specified spaces, and if you take, okay, it's the Go machine, the chess game, but now if you multiply that in thousands of occupations, you now have something that is serious. And on the cost thing which came up, if I've got the program that can do accounting, instead of having dozens of accountants once the program is made, it can be sold at if the marginal cost is zero, I will still sell at the most profit I can. And I think just in the wide array of places where we're seeing these advances, that makes this fundamentally different. And it is into thinking things. It's not into simply lifting, lifting stuff like a tractor would do. And you don't want to see people be in the old John Henry business of fighting with the, I will not fight with the Google search engine. When students ask me a question, I say, well, Google it. I don't know. My memory is not that good. If you could put a chip in my head that connected me immediately, I would look like the most brilliant professor ever. But I can't compete on that, and I don't compete on that, and no one here would want to compete on that. And that is something I think fundamentally cutting at a different point. So I agree with the commenter.
So we have the potential of things that we don't know when they will be ready, in which decade, or what scale, and what speed.
Well, the driverless car we think is coming.
Okay.
It's not like this is a science fiction story.
No, I've seen lots of things about driverless cars and trucks where it's really not going to be something for 10 to 20 years. That you can get trucks to march in a line down a highway, that's right. But there's a long way before we're going to get people driving around cities. So, the fact is that may be, so I'm not saying ignore the future or don't monitor it, but at least in my view, I got to this because I was debating with your colleagues at MIT in front of a major foundation. They wanted all sorts of money to be spent worrying about this, and my view was, we have clear and present problems right now. Why do we want to put a whole lot of money into worrying about that when, in fact, there's people who can't eat right now, don't have good jobs? We have real problems of scheduling of retail workers. Why do we want to worry about something that could be 10, 15 years from now? That's my view. I'm not saying we stop looking. I just don't want a whole conference on it.